So now that you understand implicit and explicit bias a little bit more, let's dive back into this big circle of who we are, right? So when we're looking in the green areas, race, right? There's one race in Western society, and pretty much all over the world, that is the favored race, right? If you're not the one favored race, you're going to experience bias based on your race due to the fact that you're not the one favored race. In the United States, the favored ethnicity is actually like U.S. American, right? Like apple pie, 4th of July, like all those little things that we attempt to celebrate as Americans. That would be the favored ethnicity. Some people would go, well, European ethnicity is favored. And I would say maybe not so much, given the fact that we kind of like can make fun of like German people or British people. We definitely make fun of like Italians or Irish folks. Somehow we can see these folks as less than American. And so that ethnicity is not necessarily celebrated. If you're anything but completely physical or mentally or learning able, you can see too that you might have a bias against you based on that area. Heterosexual is the favored sexual orientation in America, and generally, again, all over the world, right? Like when you look at dating websites, they're usually built for heterosexual people. When we're looking at gender, the favored gender, the gender that's going to get the most positive bias is going to be male, and then anybody but male gendered folks are favored. In Western society, we tend to favor folks in middle age. Some people think we might favor old folks, but look at where we put old folks, right? There's a bias against old folks. You can see in the presidential election, some people are attacking age, right? And then when we look at in the orange area, if you're anything but rich, you're going to experience some biases in Western society. The favored religion is Christian. Any other religion that isn't Christian might experience negative bias. Educational background. We favor educated people in this country. We treat people that aren't seen as educated as less than, or as though the work that they provide isn't as valuable. My partner's family are carpet cleaners, right? But people will treat them as though they are stupid, and they are not stupid. They are very smart and very well informed. But the perception is because they work in a trade that they're not intelligent. Work experience, you are going to be favored or disfavored by the amount of experience that you have. And one of the things we're starting to notice these days is that people want 2 to 3 years of work experience for an introductory level job. Ugh, how cool is that? Not very cool. Appearance, the more handsome or pretty you are perceived as, the more positive bias you receive. If you are seen as not good looking, or if you're seen as out of shape, you're going to experience negative bias around that. Marital status, we tend to see people in relationships or married people as more desirable, as better. There's more of a positive bias versus single, right? There's also biases based on geographic location, right? Here in Arizona, we tend to be a little bit more laid back versus people on the East Coast. People on the East Coast here in Arizona, if they bring that hurry up vibe, or if they interrupt people a lot in conversation, they will experience a negative bias with that too, right? So we all, based on these dimensions of who we are, receive positive bias based on our identities. So for me, I receive positive bias as a male. I receive positive bias as a heterosexual man. I receive positive bias for being physically able, for being relatively mentally healthy. But I also experience negative bias with race because I'm mixed and identify ethnically as Native American, right? Those aren't favored identities within the United States. I am middle class, so I do experience some negative bias because I'm not rich. My preferred religion is Christianity and Buddhism, and so I get some positive bias based on that because I am part Christian. But then because I'm Buddhist and I practice some of my Native American religions, I receive negative biases because I'm not Christian enough, right? So you can see how parts of us are favored and parts of us are disfavored, and this is part of the problem that we have to address in intercultural communication, because all parts of us are valid, right? The issue is some of the identities in those areas are favored, right? Like I'm sure if you're younger, you've experienced a negative bias based on your age, right? But if you're a capable person who knows what they're doing and can get stuff done and done well, there should be no negative bias based on age. But we experience these things based on the way the world favors or disfavors other people, right? So this gives you a sense of what identities that you may hold that are favored, as well as what identities you may hold that are disfavored. And understand, you can't be like, I'm favored in race, my race is favored. You'd have to say what race you are that is favored, right? You can't say, I'm favored with marital status. You would say, in marital status, I am favored because I am in a long-term relationship, right? You have to identify where you exist in that category to have a sense of whether you're favored or disfavored in terms of implicit or explicit bias. And then lastly, we are going to move over to hoops of perspective. We're going to talk about intersectionality, and we're going to talk about salience a little bit more too. Here, we come to understand that all these things can overlap to give us, so if we have identities that are favored, a lot of different identities that are favored, we're going to see intersectional positive bias, right? So I receive intersectional positive bias because I am a man. I consider myself a man. I gender identify as a man. I am masculine, so I'm favored for that. And then I am also heterosexual. So you see a lot of parts of my race, orientation, or not race, gender, orientation, gender identity, and gender performance, because I do things in a certain way, the world is built for me. It's very easy for me to find a partner because I can use like Tinder, and I can use Plenty of Fish, and I can use eHarmony. Like all these things are built for me. For example, if I am gay or I'm trans, people like, I know specifically eHarmony doesn't have any options for people that have those identifiers to find folks. So you can see how subtly these people have experienced a negative bias over and over again because of these disfavored identity areas. And this is one of those things that can create intersectional negative bias or intersectional positive bias. And this is part of the problem. Like, it's not bad or wrong that we're different. It's actually wonderful that we're different. The issue is we treat each other as though it's bad to be different. And we want to think about those things and try to undo our positive and negative biases in regards to like different thoughts or ideas. Because there's no reason like Christians should be more favored than any other religion. But because we see it, we hear it, like when you look around, there's a church for Christian people on like every other corner. But how many mosques do we have for Islamic or Muslim people? Where's the Buddhist temple in Phoenix, right? Thinking about those things give us a sense of what is favored and what is disfavored. And people will say, well, there's just more. And I'm like, well, maybe there's more because there's more opportunities, right? And maybe there's less opportunities to be something different. Or maybe it's seen as less than favorable to be these other things. And this is the start of what gives us these problems and issues that we start to see interculturally, where people are favored or disfavored or aren't based on their identity. We want to attempt to not favor or disfavor people and give each individual unique person, no matter what identifiers they have in all these different category areas, right? It doesn't matter like where they happen to land and on these places and spaces. We want to give everybody truly a fair shot. The problem is we treat people differently based on how they identify in these things. Like, not we like you individually. We, society, treat people different based on some of these things. And we see these things, we see these messages over and over again. And because we see these messages, we begin to internalize these messages. And we have to recognize some people are just treated different, right? Like one of the things that make us very aware of like these things is when we start to like look outside of our first person perspective and start to understand what people who are different like than us are treated like, and how they're either favored or disfavored with bias. And we want to interrupt those patterns. Like, is it good to favor heterosexual people? I mean, I don't know that it really does anything that helps anybody, right? But it's become part of the problem, part of the issue. And that's what we want to begin to address as we dive deeper into intercultural communication, and why understanding intersectionality and understanding salience is so important. Because sometimes your disfavored identities you receive negative bias for, and then when you get negative bias for your disfavored identities, you understand how that becomes very salient in that way. I have learning disabilities, and people will be like, well, just show us your notes. The notes that you write down when you watch a book, or when you read a book, or if you watch a movie, and it'll prove like I continue my research in certain areas. But I don't take notes and retain information well because of learning disabilities, right? But they assume taking notes is going to be the best way that things work, because they're not of a different learning ability like I am. And so you see how that subtle bias towards normal learning ability causes problems, because it assumes people need to be this way, or it assumes this is the best way for all people, when it's technically not. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for your time and attention, and we will get back to you in the next lecture.